So and now the third scientific consensus is that, remember the Neanderthals, the Denisovans? Well, it turns out that if you are either French, Han, that's Chinese, Melanesian, 4% of your genome is derived from the Neanderthals. So they were able to sequence the Neanderthal genome and your genome, and there was enough so it looks like we copied from each other. Now it turns out that the copying was minimal; it's only 44%. So the assumption that the Neanderthals it was basically a run and grab, like you had Neanderthal males would like grab a human female, mate with her, and she'd go back, and there would be interbreeding, and there was just enough that 4% of basically non-African. So if you look at the African DNA, they don't have any Neanderthals in them. But if you are basically French, Han, Melanesian, you have some DNA from the Neanderthals. And if you're Melanesian, if you're from Australia, you have some DNA not only from the Neanderthals, from the Denisovans. Now, the final scientific thing is, this is disputed, but most people believe this. If you look at anatomically modern humans, so 150,000 to 100,000 years ago, people looked like we are. Like they look like how we look. But behaviorally modern humans only appear 50,000 years ago. This is tool making, sophisticated weaponry, sculpture, cave painting, body ornaments. It appears only 50,000. So people call this, why did we go, what happened in this 50,000 years that made anatomically modern humans behaviorally modern? And there's an explanation. We think it's a genetic mutation that facilitates the acquisition of language. So prior to 50,000 years ago, the human beings looked like human beings, but we didn't have the ability to speak. We didn't have the ability to have culture. Okay? All right. So that was the science. Most of what we're going to talk about is there. Now I'm going to go quickly through basically the Holy Scriptures and then the Church's teaching and close with a synthesis. So what does Holy Scripture say about Adam and Eve? So if you go here, of course, you go to Genesis, the second chapter of Genesis, and we talk, all of us know, hopefully, about the creation of Adam and Eve. And the Lord makes Adam first, and then Eve from a rib. Striking it. At MIT, I met a colleague from the South, so from the Bible Belt area. I'm not sure if she was from the Buckle or from other parts of the belt. But she actually, she was absolutely convinced that Adam had one less rib, so males had one less rib than females. And so she was very troubled when she saw x-rays, and she discovered that human beings have the same number of ribs. Now, it's a very important thing to see that many, many people understand Genesis absolutely literally. And so as I bring this out and I talk about it, I'm incredibly sensitive to people are coming to this question from different places. But, and so this is a text talking about the origins of Adam and Eve. Now, it's interesting that unlike the creation narratives, the 7 days, the 6 days, that Hexameron, the Lord rested on the seventh day, there are references in the New Testament to Adam. And basically the idea here is that Jesus is the new Adam. And here you have an icon of the Lord risen, basically bringing Adam out of limbo. And there's, I don't know if there's a very famous poem, very, very appropriate for today. On Holy Saturday, the Lord descends into limbo. And there's a poem, I should have brought it, where he meets his foster father. And the poem is how he comes, and of course, limbo is waiting, and they're waiting because they know the Lord is coming, and Joseph is waiting. What's the first question that he asks the Savior? How is your mother? Isn't that beautiful? So you have that here. I mean, that's the image that in this poem, it is Adam and Eve who welcome the Lord into limbo, because they've been waiting their whole lives. Now, I want to raise a couple of things people might be aware. If you go to the story of Cain in Genesis 4, what happens is you have a reference. So Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch, and he built a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. Now, this has raised problems over the last 2,000 years, because a lot of scholars and theologians have said, well, where did all these people come from to build a city? Remember, Adam and Eve had sons, Cain and Abel. Now, Cain goes off and builds a city. Like, where are these other people from? So there's actually a tradition in the Catholic tradition has this notion of pre-Adamites. And these are people who pre-existed Adam. So I want you to understand that this discussion is much more ancient than you think. The notion of how do we explain the origins of Adam and Eve. You go to Genesis 6, the Nephilim. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men that were of old, the men of renown. Who are these? Who are the Nephilim? So these are, the Holy Scriptures records a group of people who would mate with human women. And these were the giants. I wonder, is this an ancient memory of the Neanderthals? I just throw that out there, right? I throw that out there. We know that the Neanderthals bred with our species. Could this have been an ancient memory? So that's basically where Scripture leaves us. Oops. So we've got to go to where the church is. And where is the church? The church begins, I'm going to start with 1950 Humani Generis, and this is, for the faithful cannot embrace that opinion which maintains that either after Adam there existed on this earth through men who did not take their origin through natural generation from him as from the first parent of all, or that Adam represents a certain number of first parents. So this is 1950, this is 62 years ago, Humani Generis, paragraph 37. It's actually the most authoritative statement that the Catholic Church has had on this question. Now, a lot of people don't go to the next sentence. Now, it is in no way apparent how such an opinion can be reconciled with what the sources of revealed truths propose with regard to original sin. So the reason why the faithful cannot embrace this opinion is because the church in 1950 did not know how you could reconcile a notion of polygenism with the church's understanding of original sin, which is why we need to reflect upon what the church teaches with regards to original sin. Now, this is Pope Paul VI. We are going 16 years into the future, right? You have the Holy Father again talking about Adam and Eve, and you notice that the focus again is on original sin. Which start from the presupposition of polygenism, which is not proved, and deny more or less clearly that the sin which has been such an abundant source of evils for mankind has consisted above all in the disobedience which Adam, the first man, and the figure of the future Adam committed at the beginning of history. So the church is very clear. What is most important in this discussion is the theological doctrine surrounding original sin. Now, if we move to the Catechism, what happens is the church acknowledges that science has a role to play in the origins of our species. Now, we get to several statements on how you deal with original sin and how you deal with the reading of the first accounts of Genesis. So here you go. The biblical account expresses this reality in symbolic language. So it's already important to understand that for the Catholic, there are parts of Genesis that should be read symbolically. The question, of course, is which parts, right? Now, the church, interpreting the symbolism of biblical language in an authentic way, teaches that our first parents, Adam and Eve, were constituted in original state of holiness and justice. And then notice the account of the fall in Genesis 3 uses figurative language but affirms a primeval event. So you have history, but you have literature. You have both coming together, and trying to discern how they come together is the challenge of faith and reason. By his sin, the first man loses original holiness, not only for himself and for all his descendants. And very important, we are therefore, all the descendants are deprived of original holiness and justice, and this is called original sin. So this, in a sense, gives you what we're working with. Now here you have Blessed John Paul II in 1996. He brings up Humani Generis in 1950. He talks about there is no conflict between evolution and the doctrine of the faith. This is something I just have to emphasize over and over again. For the Catholic, there is no conflict between evolutionary thought and our faith, the faith of the gospel, as long as several things are held. And these are the several things, right? First, the origin of the human body comes through living matter which existed previously. The spiritual soul is created directly by God. This is one of the things that we must hold as we try to bring these two together. Now I'm just going to, this is very, very controversial. The Holy Father then says evolution is more than a hypothesis. And people are like, well, what does that mean? I'm like, what is a hypothesis? That's science and religion. I mean, that's another lecture. But I just wanted to point out that for the Holy Father, there is no need to reject evolution if you are able to work with faith and reason to bring it together. Now, this is now going to 2004. This is the International Theological Commission, chaired at the time by our now Holy Father Benedict XVI. Now, I want you to see where the church is moving. So in 2004, you see that the church in one of her documents says that the human species starts off in Africa in a humanoid population of common genetic lineage. So right away there's already a hint of a common genetic population. And in that same document, Catholic theology affirms that the emergence of that first members of the human species. Now notice it says, whether as individuals or in populations. So the church is open. The church is open to an account that recognizes populations of people as the origin of our species. But what's important is that it represents an event that is not of pure natural explanation, but has to be appropriately be attributed to divine intervention. So how, in the last 5 minutes, how do you reconcile it? I'm just going to propose. First thing is we have to say that you have to try to reconcile it. There are people who believe that we do not have to work at this. You can have science and you have faith and they're separate. But that is not the Catholic Church, right? So here, faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. Now for the Dominican, this brings tears. This is the Dominican life, right? This is our life. This defines our life. I study and I pray. And both together, with the grace of God, will lead you to the contemplation of truth. And this, of course, is the opening line of Fides et Ratio. And so I have to affirm that before we even jump into trying to bring it together. This is something that God is calling us to do. Second, right? This is the catechism again. It's important to see that science, research, if it does not override moral laws, can never conflict with the faith. Now, I bring this up because I had friends at MIT when I was in graduate school. When we would talk about evolution, I would say, what about the fossils? And they'd say, well, Satan put the fossils in the ground because he wanted to lead you astray. Now, it's striking because once you hold to that, science becomes incredibly hard to do. because you're not quite sure if it's Satan's work. Right? And so, especially as Dominicans, we have to affirm that creation is wonderful. Creation is awesome and it's good. And God leads us to himself and to our glorification through creation. I mean, the Summa is all about how God creates and it goes forth and we return to him. And so I have to say this once again just to remind you that science, if it is done contemplatively, hopefully, if it's there to look for truth, should not conflict. So we have that reassurance that somehow it fits. We might not be able to put it together, but somehow it fits. Now, one of the things I have to point out is that we have to talk about scientific findings. Are they trustworthy? Now, yesterday on the plane, I was reading the Summa. I love the Summa. And I was reading on so there's a question at the end of the Prima Pars where our brother Thomas Aquinas looks at where is Eden? So he uses the best science of his day. It's really cool to read. It's very comforting for me as a biologist because he will say, well, it's probably near the equator because the equator is the most moderate. But then he says, but there are some people who say that it's way too hot because if the sun goes right above you, it will burn you to death. So if you look at you see he's dealing with the best science of his day to try to figure out where Eden is. It's in Africa. Basically, based on the genomic research, if you see Eden as that place where we as a species were born, it was in Africa. So, but you notice he had to use his science, and well, we know today that people living in the equator are not burnt up. He did at that time, 800 years ago. So we have to ask, are the scientific findings that I talked to, are they trustworthy? Are they believable? And all I can tell you is this. This is a principle in science, right? As the evidence mounts in favor of a hypothesis, especially what we call convergent data from independent laboratories using different techniques and methods, then it becomes increasingly unlikely that rival hypotheses are true. You see, the story I gave you is dependent not upon one lab, it's dependent upon hundreds of labs working all over the planet using different techniques and different approaches to look at the question. They all come to one general picture. And so as a biologist, that's why we would say it's reasonable. And we know this common sense, right? So if you are a juror on a member of a jury, and you have 12 witnesses who tell you the same thing about what happened at the accident, it is likely you will believe that's the truth. Especially if no one contradicts them. You go, well, 12 people seeing the same thing, it's very likely to be true. That's the same common sense logic we're using. We have so many people all over the planet doing so many different things, looking at the same question, coming to the same answer, that it's likely that this explanation is the true one. So then how do you do it? What you have to do is you have to ask the question. This is the last bit, is this. Well, which theological doctrines have to be reconciled? And I would tell you it has to deal with original sin. We have to focus on the church's teaching on original sin. And this is really what we have to talk about. The loss of original holiness and justice, and the transmission of this loss through human nature, which we call original sin. Now there's one thing that I also have to point out. The reason why the New Testament refers to Adam is because the Lord, the Savior of the world, is the new Adam. He assumes our common human nature and then redeems it, which is why we have to affirm a common human nature. Now, I was talking at lunch today. A lot of people assume that monogeneism is something that we've held for many generations. It turned out, at the turn of the 20th century in the South, there was a movement to go towards polygenism. Do you know why? because there were people who wanted to argue that Africans were descended from people other than Adam and Eve. And they wanted to use that account to justify the difference between whites and blacks. One of the things that the scripture is very, very clear on is we are all the same stock. And there have been movements over history to try to deny that for one reason or the other. But theologically, we affirm that we are the same stock because it is that stock, if you are that is redeemed. If my nature is not the nature that my Savior redeemed, that undermines my certitude that I am redeemed. You understand? There is something profoundly important in affirming that the Lord assumed the nature that He did, our nature, so that we would be able to participate in His nature, which is divine, so that we, as they say, we can be like God. Isn't that amazing? Whew, I can't wait. So now I'm just going to say that these are the things that we need to be able to hold together. He created the human species as rational creatures at a particular moment in history, in a state of innocence and original justice. All of these prehistoric humans shared a common human rational nature. He is immediately responsible for the creation of every human soul. At some moment in history, all of them fell. They lost the preternatural gifts of infused knowledge, loving obedience, spontaneous virtue in the absence of suffering and death, because of a singular act of disobedience. This state of original sin was then transmitted to all future human beings by propagation and not by imitation. This is the Council of Trent. And then this common human nature would be assumed and redeemed by the Savior of the world. Basically, that is what we have to hold. Now, how do we put that together? And this is my last slide. I'm going to propose one scenario. There are numerous ways. This is one way, right? Hominins evolved into archaic humans that are anatomically modern about 150,000 to 100,000 years ago. At a single moment in time, and I say after the Toba super eruption. So remember, the population, we're nearly, in fact, people say, we nearly went extinct because the population was so small. God infuses a small population of these hominins with a spiritual soul. They become rational animals. And I say, is that the reason why there's a great leap forward? Is there a reason why there's 100,000 years of the absence of culture? Because really what happens is the soul had to come for culture to appear. Adam is a member, possibly the tribe leader, and my students love to argue about how we're all going to put this together. He and his wife disobeyed the Lord in some way, leading the rest of the tribe to do the same. So the whole population falls. And then the descendants would migrate and eventually colonize the planet. We are here. We're all descended from that. See, that is a proposition of a way to try to bring these two together. So I'm going to end. I've got to end. The first is, this is my lab at Providence College. I told them I'd put their picture in. We study programmed cell death, cell suicide, so they're the Dead Yeast Society, because all they do is kill yeast in cool and interesting ways. And this is the lab mascot. This is Hermit. Long story for why he's there, but I have some incredible students. And the great thing about doing research with my students is we can run the polyacrylamide gel the same time we're talking about the Brothers Karamazov. You know, it's because they all have to take Civ, regardless of their major. So all my biology students have read the tradition. Now, some of them hate Civ because they can't imagine why they have to read Dante if they want to be a doctor. And I tell them because one day you're going to help someone to die. And at that point, it's more about being a human being than being a doctor that's important. And then they go, really? I was like, wait, you come back in 50 years. And I say, if you know Dante, you'll be able to talk to that soul. You can talk as much cancer. She's not going to listen to you. She wants to talk about Paradiso. and you have to be able to talk about that. So during the summers, I run the lab during the summer. So during the year, they do their research. Like this afternoon, they're like, Father, where are you? I'm in Nashville. Can we Skype? So they do research, and so wherever I am in the world, if they have a question, we Skype. So I can't imagine doing this without Skype. But this is my apostolate. So Father Hyacinth Marie Cordell is one of my brothers. He's a newly ordained priest. And we've been talking about this for 5 years. He entered the order. He didn't believe in evolution. And so we just talked and talked and talked and talked and talked. Now, I was a priest when he entered, so talking to a student brother is not as easy. So we would just talk and come, and when the community would gather, we'd sit at a table and he'd just ask him. He wrote, before he was ordained to the holy priesthood, he wrote a 33-page paper on the question. And he just summarized a lot of our arguments. So, and he is now assigned to the parish of St. Pius V in Providence. So our talks are continuing. I am teaching a class, Honors 480, an Honors Colloquium in Science and Religion this semester. And believe me, they've asked the questions. And it's wonderful to be able to propose possible answers. And then my own laboratory is funded by grants from the NSF, the NIGMS, and the Rhode Island INVI program, which is the federal government science infrastructure program for the state of Rhode Island. Thank you very much. Any questions? Father?
I was under the understanding the concept that the magisterial document proposing a multiplicity allowance.
Yes, it was actually in the discussion of original sin.
In Trent, there's no magisterial statement stating a multiplicity allowance
Of
atoms.
Of atoms, right. In fact, they avoided that question completely.
There's no magisterial document declaring the multiplicity of people upon original sin. Yeah.
The church has been quiet on that.
And the issue that you've skipped is how original sin is passed on, because I had this debate this afternoon on Pier who said the debate is it about education or human generation? So if we say it's about human generation, one couple of saying all the rest, we completely undermine the idea that original sin is passed on by generation. And there's no need for the immaculate conception there, because if original sin is passed on in education rather than generation, we have no need for spotless virgin to give birth to the incarnate word. If you're reconciling, is it an educational formation issue rather than a human generation that passes on original sin? There is no need for immaculate conception.
I mean, I struggled with that question until I read Aquinas. And Aquinas' account, to me, is incredibly powerful because the one thing that I find so illuminating is how our brother Aquinas wants to say, so I give you, were lions meat eaters before the fall? Okay, so now, it's interesting because many of my friends who are Protestants were saying that everything was vegetarian, right? And that the fall was, so meat eating only happened after the fall. Now, Aquinas will deal with this in his discussion on the original state. And he will say to say that is to give sin more power than you should give it. Because you see, if you say that before the fall lions were vegetarian and they were then meat eaters, carnivores after, then you have to say that sin was so powerful it could change nature. Right?
It's the same thing.
I prefer Aquinas.
Is it fair to go to Aquinas for the Immaculate Conception? I mean, is he to consider the world's expert on the Immaculate Conception? My issue is we have completely So the issue is that original sin passed on by human generation or by education.
Well, I'm saying that, so if it's a deprivation, so Aquinas' notion is that the preternatural gifts were given to the original people, they were then removed, well, they were rejected. And so the preternatural gifts were then rejected, and so human nature, which in its in its fallen state, so when Adam and Eve had children, they just gave to Adam and Eve their children their nature. But their nature was deprived of these preternatural gifts that we should have had. And he talks about the infused knowledge to strengthen the intellect, right? The ordering of the will. The will is ordered to reason. The sensitive appetites are ordered towards the higher powers. And then the impassibility and the basically immortality of the body. So these were gifts that were given to us through that's the notion of the original justice. And so when our parents' original forebears rejected them, so when they were propagated, they simply could give what they could give, and they could not give those preternatural gifts. So original sin that is by generation, not because they gave us original sin, but the deprivation, the absence of these preternatural gifts are simply handed down one generation to the other. And the idea of the Immaculate Conception is that at the moment of her conception, the Mother of God was given the gifts that Adam and Eve had. Well, not all of them, some of them. That preserved her in a state where she was not subject to the deprivation that we all experience. And so she was the Ark of the Covenant, the new Ark of the Covenant, to allow the Word to be conceived in her, as we will remember next week.
And by the virgin birth, she was totally separated from generation. Right point.
Virgin birth.
Giving birth to her son as a virgin.
Well, I think oh, sure.
Yeah. So she was totally separate. I think that's the big issue with human generation. I mean, it's a wonderful thing.
So she was conceived in her parents, right? So she herself was conceived the way that we are all conceived. It's just that at the time of her conception, she was given gifts that were denied us. Now, well, her son was God. So that's, I mean, I'm sorry? Well, I think we can say this. She gave him a share in his in her human nature. The X chromosome. His X chromosome came from his mother. His Y chromosome came from the Holy Spirit. And so he has a human nature fully like ours. And in a sense, he foreshadows our human nature as it will be glorified.
Is your scheme where there's the cross-fertilization?
Cross-fertilization.
From the Han, the Melanesia, the French. Pope John Paul II spoke for humanity. He intimately connected to personhood. Okay? And that's my drama to think. That Ratzinger said we must keep a few fixed points in line. For me, generation is one. I appreciate what you said. I don't agree. The second one is we have a humanity that may be, in this schema, somewhat deprived of personhood. Albeit what you said about separating, polygenesis and leading to racism. And that's my anxiety about this. When we're using this word humanism, rather than saying pre-human, we end up saying subhuman somehow, because where does personhood begin in this?
So that's a wonderful question. As you notice in my account, I point out that the human comes to be when the rational soul is given.
The word.
I'm sorry?
Language, the word.
Well, right. Okay. So, so we now have to talk about the spiritual origin. So the soul that is given to the first human being is of a radically different kind than the souls of pre-hominins, the hominins that we're talking about. They're not persons, exactly. So the persons persons, properly speaking, are rational animals. And so so my students will come up with these questions. Well, does that mean that Adam and Eve's grandparents were not human? And you say yes. Or subhuman or pre-human, or they're non-persons. I mean, that's the best way to put it. Now, of course, we live in an age today, and this is the other half of my brain, the bioethics side, where personhood becomes so slippery that human rights that have usually been reserved to persons are now being extended to non-human so-called persons.
But my drama is, you're saying this is human tissue by DNA.
Mm-hmm.
The drama is in our embryonic stem cell debate that our opponents are saying, well, it's human tissue DNA-wise, but it's not a person. And we're saying an embryonic stem cell represents radically a person. And that's
Okay, not an embryonic stem cell. We actually do not say that. We have to say the embryo. Okay, so the embryonic stem cell, which is derived from the embryo, we do not attribute personhood. Now, the difference, we say, is that the reason why an embryonic stem cell is not a person while an embryo is because there is an organismal quality associated with the embryo that is not present in the stem cell. And that we have to talk about the human organism. And the human organism, why is the human organism, now going back to hylomorphic theory, now predisposed to be infused by a rational soul? And we can talk about that.
the drama is this line of argument, to me, underlines our fight.
In what way?
Well, we start saying an embryo is a person, okay, but once you've got stem cells from embryos, you don't identify them in the same way.
That's true, because if I scratch my skin and they fall to the ground,
That's an adult stem cell.
nope, that's actually not true. That's a fibroblast. So it's you have to be very careful with your language.
It is our fight about the embryonic stem cell.
I don't understand why that's the case.
Because we're trying to make a very clear distinction that this embryonic stem cell is representative of a human person.
No, we have to. The embryo is a person. The embryonic stem cell is not a person. In fact, we have to say that over and over because an embryonic stem cell is a cell and not an organism.
I get your point, but the line, the argument, at time pushes, Bush said we allow some stem cells.
Yep.
Carmel in California says that this is a huge change. We're no longer making this an identity. It's like saying the human remains that we use in Auschwitz.
Okay.
And you say I don't want to go to too much concentration camp.
No.
But you're saying this is not representative of a person. Anyway, I'm taking up far too much time.
Thank you. Questions?
Yeah, I have just two things, three things. Right? First is I think I can clarify what Father's saying, if I understand it correctly. Your hypothesis is that the first man and the first woman, or the first group of people, are born of fully physically human, biologically human organisms that are non-personal. So if there could be a non-personal human organism biologically in the past, why can't there be that?
Right. So if you notice, I talked about a mutation. So what I'm saying is that, no, in fact, what I'm proposing is that, we're going down to the detail that is simply beyond the purview of the type of science that we're doing right now. Right. What I'm saying is that there is a biological, physiological change such that the hominins prior to this hominization are actually they're physiologically and genetically different from before the hominization as compared to after. The problem is we do not have a record of that. All we know is that there's cultural differences, and we can trace the cultural differences. And so I'm positing, and again, maybe 100 years from now we'll be able to make this clear, but I'm positing that there is some change, it has to be a biological change, that now predisposes the matter for hominization in a way it didn't before.
Okay, then my own question would be something like, if we look at an organism like Homo
Gargantus.
right? Here we have a being, some hominid, who buried its dead in a ritual manner. So I think...
Is Heidelberg? I know Neanderthals.
Okay, so,
Right, so
not this
I...
right, which buried its dead in a ritual manner. Now, to me, that says a spiritual nature. You see what I'm saying?
Oh, sure.
So then, would you suggest that this is a prelapsarian being?
Right, so in my third year of formation, I had wrote a 25-page paper on whether or not Neanderthals had rational souls. And, I mean, that's something many can think about, right? So you sit there and you go through, it was from my philosophical anthropology class, and so I had to go through the history, like what do we know about Neanderthals, and I mean, it was a 25-page paper. Basically, I was saying, this is really crazy. I posited, because yes, they were able to bury their dead, but what is very clear is that they did not have a fully, their tool work and their ability to, and this was what I was saying, their ability to abstract was limited. So you look at their tools, and you can tell, like if you look at our ancestors, when they made tools, you could tell that they had a plan in their brain, and they were able to make these cutting tools based on a plan. And that's where you know there's abstraction. But we were having difficulties seeing that in Neanderthals, and so for this long, convoluted reason, I said that they had souls that were not as fully rational as ours. And you'll say, well, for an Aristotelian, you have to find a specific difference for that. And you're like shaking your head. And you have to go and look at Aristotle, right? And so you have to sit there and you have to, again, this is where you sit there and you go and you try to explain how to put it all together. I mean, this is the same, you go look at the American Catholic Philosophical Quarterly, they're trying to figure out if aliens have souls. I mean, and in fact, Aquinas will look at this 800 years ago. He will look to see if extraterrestrials are also human, they're also rational. How can you conclude that? So I'm not going to go into that any further because I'd have to go into Aristotelian philosophical anthropology to explain. I basically said they couldn't laugh, but that's a different, because the ability to laugh is a specific difference. You actually, I don't know if you realize that to see a joke requires abstraction. And it is the quality that defines, if you go look at Aristotle and Aquinas, it is the ability to have humor that is profoundly human. You'll never see a dog laugh or a monkey laugh because to see a joke is an abstraction. You know, you see someone walking and they slip on a banana and you laugh. Why? Why do you find it? And that, it turns out there's a whole explanation for to see a joke. The ability to see a joke means you have to be able to abstract two things that happen to be together in ways that they shouldn't be together. So like you see, Sister President walking and she slips on, you're like, Sister President, banana. It's very funny because of this juxtaposition of abstractions. And so I basically end up saying they couldn't laugh. Yes?
I'm not sure Father, are you saying Neanderthals were persons or not?
No, I didn't. I said they were not persons. Now, what is striking is this was before we knew they're interbred. And this is actually a question in biology today. Are Neanderthals and our species the same species, given that they were able to breed and have reproductively viable offspring? This is tricky because biologically we define species by the ability to produce viable offspring. And if 4% of my genes come from the Neanderthals, then obviously there were reproductively viable offspring when a human and a Neanderthal bred. So I'm actually, and this is something I actually am beginning to posit that one of the difficulties with the biological definition of species, which limits speciation to mating, is that it does not take into account the more philosophical, abstract ability to abstract, to look at nature in a way that we need to. Yes. Are the offspring persons? I I don't know. I will ask the Lord that. I mean, that's one of those things that's beyond reason right now. Like, I cannot tell. It's hard to know how, there are possibilities. They're all persons. Some are persons, some are not. You see, so there are all sorts of possibilities. This is one of the things I'll ask him when I see him face to face.
But today the implications are trying to make a half human, half animal.
Oh no, and not only that, you haven't raised the question, bestiality, right? I mean, so if a human being mated with an animal, what do we say about that? Now, you have to understand this is nothing new, because Aquinas will talk about, how about incest? Because clearly, if you have Adam and Eve, right, if you have Adam and Eve are the only two, and they have kids, and there's all of us here, something had to happen. You understand? So, who did Cain marry? Now, so Aquinas will spend, not just Aquinas, the tradition will spend a lot of time talking about there is an early dispensation at the very beginning of time, because otherwise, what are you going to say? All these people are committing a grave moral injustice. I mean, they're mating with their siblings. You see, so there are theological. So are there questions? Yes, but there have been questions for 2,000 years.
But one of the fixed points of Ratzinger was there was no gradual installment.
Yep, I'm not saying there's.
Well, if we've got these Neanderthals.
Well, that's why I'm not saying it was a gradual. I'm actually saying it's another kind of soul that doesn't exist anymore. Nope. Mm-hmm. And that 25-page paper has never been published, thanks be God. Yep.
Yes, I understand you that kind of, if you look at the scientific story, there's this line of demarcation that you're placing with that volcano, that prior to that event, we had human creatures, and after that event, we had human persons starting to develop.
Well, more properly, I would say that it's not. So I'm saying not the volcano wasn't it. I'm saying that after the volcano, the ancestral population, we call them archaic humans, got really, really small. What was left was really small because they had to deal with basically an ice age that was rapid. That you have a very small population. And it's surprising that you have that shrinking, that bottleneck in the population size coinciding with an apparent radical change in their behavior. And so I'm saying, is it possible? I'm just saying, is it possible that it was at that point that you have this harmonization event of some sort?
And from a theological perspective, that's the birth of the soul.
Well, exactly. At that point, philosophically and theologically, that would be the point where, prior to that, humans would not have a spiritual, rational soul, and after that, we have a spiritual, rational soul. Yes, ma'am.
First of all, let me say thank you very much for coming. I feel a little uncomfortable with all the ideas, but very, very open to embracing them too. So, talk about evolution and really that's kind of been an underlying assumption that...
Is it true?
Yes. So, when I imagine sort of stereotypical evolution, you have rules of time, right? And, creatures evolving and changing from one species into another one and another one. So, and eventually into human beings. So, number one is that what you're saying? And number two, how would you explain creatures that have a symbiotic relationship, or like a nerve cell that has to receive a certain stimulus and then has to have the interpretation, in the brain, like those things would have had to happen coincidentally by themselves at the exact same time. Like that's not making sense.
Okay, so I will deal with your first question first by going back to Aquinas. If you go to question 103 to 106 of the Prima Pars, where he talks about the governance of the world. So how does God guide his creation? One of the things that, again, was illuminating for me is he said that it is striking that one of the things that God can do is he can give the dignity of causality to his creation. And what does that mean in English? What that means is this, right? You and I can write books, but you and I cannot make a book that writes itself. So the thing that is so awesome about God is that he can give what he makes the power to be makers on their own. Which is why Aquinas will say that it is incredibly amazing that he gave us the ability to be authentic causes. And he says it is properly speaking, it is more proper to divine action that God give his creatures the ability to create rather than he create something himself. Because you and I can create things, but we can't make things that create themselves. So theologically, we have to start with that. So we assume that it is more awesome that God made creation like this. Boom. But Aquinas is saying that could we not see that God saying, all right, I'm going to make this amazing universe, and I am going to give this universe the ability to make new things, to evolve. Now, so that's the first thing. The second thing now is the thing about Aquinas in the discussion on fate, like the governance of the universe, question 107 on fate. People would ask, well, is there fate? Is everything just governed by God, by chance? And he will say, well, God guides the world from within. And so he can make things happen from within without undermining or destroying their nature. So with these two theological principles in mind, the proposition is this: could God not have made a world 13.8 billion years ago when we had the Big Bang, and given that world that he created the ability to evolve, and that he guided that evolution at every single moment, knowing that eventually, 150,000 years ago, he would make something in his image and likeness? You see, so you have to be able to imagine this incredibly... The way I see God is, he's a painter. And he's painting this amazing picture. And sometimes he just has to paint the background first. Now, he knows what it's going to be. And you might occasionally you go, oh my God, it looks terrible. It looks really slimy, right? But he knows what it's going to be because he's going to make it. So 13.8 billion years, first of all, you've got Adam and Eve, right? And then you have his mother. Oh my God, perfect creature. There she is. And that's like the epitome of creation, is the mother of God. Because her son is special. But when I look at creation, I go, where did creation rise to its point? The mother of God. And so, which is why, for example, people will say, why did the Lord choose bread for the Holy Eucharist? And Aquinas will say that's inverted. He made bread for the Eucharist. So 13.8 billion years ago, in the course of evolution, he knew that bread would evolve because he planned that so that his son would be able to take those crushed stalks and transform them into his body. I mean, that's really, the thing about Aquinas is you see it completely differently. I mean, and we have it, we are a world where we see the world as being the center of the universe. God is the center of the universe. And so my brothers have worked very hard to convert me, who is a materialist. I'm a materialist, and a Jansenist, and a Pelagian all at once. And my brothers have worked incredibly hard to using theology and lots of prayer to change my mind on these things. So with regards to your question on thought, we have to remember that thought is primarily in the soul. Now, this is very hard. I have to hit my head because I'm like, it's in the brain. No, the brain, it's primarily in the soul, working in and through the brain. But we have to be very careful. So we go, well, is it the... So when you talk about the neurons and the glia and all of that, it was all there, but it couldn't think. It could not do the abstraction because matter is restricted. Matter, by its very definition, has limits to it. And so you needed a spiritual principle in order to liberate matter so that it was able to think not only just eternal thoughts, right? But just, I mean, I can go to Rome in my mind now. I mean, that is, when you think about that, I can move there in my mind, and that is the soul working. My dog can never do that. I could take him to Rome, but I couldn't say, all right, come back now, go to Rome. He's unable, his matter is trapped in its materiality. And so you need the soul to liberate matter, and that's how we have thought. And that's how we have language. Because language requires universals. I need to say things like boy, or even more, beauty. I mean, when my students in science and religion are all materialists, and first of all they go, we don't have free will, Father. And I smack one of them, and I go, I'm sorry, I didn't have free will, I had to smack you. But Father said, you see? So you come down and you see how we are so materialistic, not in the sense of consumeristic, which we are, because of fallen human nature, but also we think in terms of matter. And what Aquinas allows us to do is he challenges us to see the world as God sees the world. Yes, sister?
I was just wondering about, we keep talking about macroevolution and microevolution, and how macroevolution seems to be really formative for the first teaching. And you're proposing that macroevolution is scientifically verifiable. So, is what you're proposing suggesting that macroevolution is possible but only in union with the actual body? And then if so, can life come from non-life? Like, is what you're saying that life can come from non-life, and again, only the union with the actual body?
Okay, so I'll start by saying that, as our brother Aquinas will point out, everything that is created, everything that exists, falls under God's providence. So that's the very first thing. So anything that happens with matter, God makes. God does, he guides. He calls to himself, number one. The second thing is that the difference between matter and non-living matter and living matter is not as wide and is not as vast as the difference between living non-rational matter and living rational matter. And if we are able to say without a blink of an eye and say that we can make, I mean, when you're talking about making living matter from non-living matter, if we say that God is able to make rational matter from non-rational matter, then the transition between living matter and non-living matter is actually much smaller. And so I say yes, I will say that yes, I will attribute to the providence of God, who is 3 in 1, right, the ability to make living out of non-living. Do we know how he did that? No, we do not. We do not know. We can see the beginning, we can see the matter, we can see the living matter. We have not been able to pinpoint that transition. We know it happened. We don't know how it happened at the natural level. I know that however it happened at the natural level, God was working through it providentially. Now, you raised the question between macroevolution and microevolution. Now, it's striking because from a biological perspective, there is no difference mechanistically between microevolution and macroevolution. It's a matter of time. Microevolution, given enough time, will look like macroevolution. Now, a lot of people will say, well, I don't know how dogs and cats could have evolved. I mean, they're so different. You know, how could they evolve from a common ancestor? And I tell the story about how in Mexico, there are American tourists who go to Mexico and they buy what they thought was a really, really cute dog. and it turned out to be a rat. Right? So now it's really interesting. It's really interesting because it tells you something about how we perceive dogs. If you have a little Chihuahua and a German Shepherd, the differences between those two organisms is vast. And, but we don't need a supernatural explanation to explain how these two breeds, the differences in these breeds were generated from a common ancestor. And I believe the most recent data is that they evolved from wolves several times about 14,000 years ago.